Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the Classic Rock and Prog Almanac. Today with myself, Tim Appleton, or Lobby Todd. Now, today I'm going to be looking at Brian Eno, so to speak. More specifically, his album Before and After Science from 1977, otherwise known as Rock as Quantum Physics. I'm sure I'm not the biggest Eno fan. I haven't been through his albums slavishly. There's certainly a lot of them, isn't there? I do have a family connection with him. He's from where I grew up. And my parents were taught oboe by his uncle. I realise that's not the greatest claim to fame story, but it is a claim to fame story. This is my favourite Eno album, then, of the ones that I know, let's say. I'm not saying it's his best, but it's my favourite, right? Part of that might depend on whether you like rock music or ambient more. I think a lot of his ambient work is really good, the stuff that I'm familiar with. I suppose I just have a weakness for rock, as the audience might have guessed. And I think this album is an absolute masterpiece. There is a thematic element to it, that the reason why I like it so much. But also I think that just the harmonic and melodic writing here is unmatched on his other works, not just on his early rockish works, but in I would say in rock music in general, really. I think this was his last sort of full-on rock solo album. Although I'm willing to be corrected on that. In any case, I much prefer this to anything by Roxy Music, I have to say. But again, I'll be corrected on that as well, I'm sure. I think what this album shows is that Eno is a node, as they say, right? That's to say, everyone who's anyone in progressive rock music, in the more general sense of progressive rock, is working on this album. You got Phil Collins and Percy Jones, later not later. Phil Collins' bandmate Percy Jones from Brand X. Robert Fripp, King Crimson. Fred Frith from Henry Cow. Phil Manzanera from Roxy and the Roxys. Robert Wyatt, formerly of Soft Machine. Dave Mattox from Fairport Convention. And Andy Fraser from Free, curiously enough, who my dad once gave a lift to on the M1. He was hitchhiking. There's also some krauts on this album, in inverted commas, i.e. German rock musicians. Dieter Möbius and Hans Joachim Rodelius from Cluster. And Jackie Liebzeit from Cannes. I'm sure I pronounced some of those names wrong. Apologies to our many German listeners. I think this album, Before and After Science, can be described as a postmodern album. This is one of my familiar theme for those who know my comments in previous episodes. In what sense postmodern? Well, it's very eclectic, first of all. Each song different from all the others in terms of mood and style. I think what happened was he just built up a lot of feels, as it were, and sort of played around with them until some of them he found presentable. And here they are, they're on this album. There was a story that he wrote 100 songs for this album, and these are the 10 that survived. I think Eno works sort of circumstantially, situationistically, if you like. And yeah, thematically it's Pomo as well. All the scientific references here are quantum, as far as I can make out. And so are the musical ones, in a sense. This is a slightly minimalist album, in the best possible sense. It actually reminds me of Erik Satie and, his penchant for functional music. I think that was probably very influential on Eno. That's to say, sort of empirical music, in the sense that the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, admired the kind of radical empiricist materialism of the Anglo-Saxon cultures. Cue Anglo-Saxon jingle on the podcast. And what else? Very funny, this album, very humourful. I think the title is important, Before and After Science. In other words, it's not a chronological reference. It means simultaneously before and after science. So time is kind of compacted at this point, which, of course, is a reference to quantum mechanics. Of course. Now, let's do some Empirifacts. This is Eno's 5th solo album, released December 1977, recorded in London and Cologne. I told you there was a krautrock element. Released on Polydor in the UK, Ireland in the States. In the States, it reached 171 on Billboard, which is brilliant, of course. Great chart position, that. And 45 in Australia. I mention Australia because we have an increasing number of Australian listeners to the podcast. Hello, guys. So yeah, that's it. So there you go. That was Empirifacts. What about the cover? Well, it's black and white, isn't it? And it depicts Eno's face, Brian Eno's face. But yeah, it's literally black and white, isn't it? I mean, it's divided between the two colours. In other words, we have a person here, namely Eno, Brian Eno. Eno, I didn't mention this is the beginning of emo music as well. This album, you could say that, I suppose. Anyway, here Eno, I would say in this image is sort of subsumed by the void, right? Which is a topic we'll come back to later on because it comes up in a couple of the tracks. Now let's do tracks. Side 1 begins with No One Receiving. Now this is a funky little number, and it reminds me of sort of a little bit of future Talking Heads stuff that Eno also worked on famously, right? So Talking Heads is a sort of is often a metonymous, is that the word? Metonymic, sorry, referencing of Eno and Talking Heads. It makes sense because this is Talking Heads sounding, this track. What happens here musically on this first number? Well, I think it's in E flat as far as I can make out the track, and it moves constantly between E flat and D flat, or C sharp if you prefer. But the thing is that in each case, in the case of the two chords, the bass goes a tone lower still, right? In both cases. So this is interesting because it subverts the overall key. Essentially, each chord change here is a key change, which makes the chord change exceptionally dramatic. You have the bass to thank for that. And this is underscored, excuse the pun, by the guitar part, which plays the chord a tone lower than the overall chord and with an added sixth, and slides up from the chord a tone lower than that. So it apes the bass. In other words, the guitar part apes the bass part, but a tone lower. So it's like they're doing two different keys, but a third one is thrown in for good measure as a sort of spectral presence. I think this might go with the theme of No One Receiving, which is the title of the track. In other words, the other is a ghost, right? So we've got, as it were, spectres of Marx here, or what the French philosopher Jacques Derrida calls hauntology, right? So we're already in the realms of the as it were, the hyper postmodern here, which is what Eno's always been interested in, really. Culturally speaking, and this is sort of this spectral element is kind of prefigured by the anacrusis of the shaker at the beginning of the track. I think almost as if the track has started without us, right? So, in other words, who is the spectre here? Is it us or the person we're trying to speak to? Hence the lyric of the song, which is about a radio broadcast to God knows who. Sorry, little drinky poos there. This is why the song comes to the following conclusion. Nobody hears us when we're alone in the blue future. No one's receiving the radio's splintered ways. That's what he sings. Eno's singing this one, of course. I suspect the metaphor here is not just about the imbalance between broadcaster and audience on the radio, but also between humans and other potential species in the universe, right? That's why he says blue future. Because we are the future for somebody he was observing us from the other side of the universe. And of course, we look blue, right? So, in sum, this song is all about the spectral presence of the other, I would say, and it's done with great humour too, which will be a constant on this record, as I've already mentioned. Humour is also important because it evokes distance, i.e. distance from the other, as in the theme of this very song. All right, good. Number 2, side 1, track 2, Backwater. Now, what I find interesting about this track is that it's a fairly straightforward pop song, like bracing, fun. But the tune contains what's called a devil's interval, the diabolus in musica. Remember, we've mentioned that before, right? So it's something like this. Get the guitar. It's in F major, so it's black water, that water. Okay. That's all I wanted to say on that. In other words, it contains a tune that doesn't fit, right? Which I think reflects the theme here, because the theme is about a trip by various functionaries into a backwater, as it's called in English, right? I.e., hence the name of the track, Backwater, i.e. An obscure provincial location, possibly tropical. And there seem to be, as I say, functionaries there, hence the references to a senator, an emperor, a conquistador, and a Turkish guru, and a daughter who's apparently going to be worshipped, but actually she becomes a scientist instead. So there's another reference to science there. And again, a very contemporary one, because what he says of this girl is she's going to split and define, he says, in quotes, i.e. split the atom, of course. And Eno concludes here that we should abandon the ballistics of the mystics and resign to be trapped like a leaf on the vine, i.e. embrace our quantum contingency, as it were. Now here, Eno seems to be making an explicit reference to before and after science in its modern sense, i.e. you have a quantum physicist trapped in the jungle with the spiritualists, right? Which were the sort of colonized cultures, presumably of South America. I mean, that seems to be the implication, but I mean, it could be anywhere else, I suppose, Africa, Asia. And again, played for comedy. It's a bit like a Carry On film, this one, which British people might know about Carry On films, a series of bawdy comedy films about various absurd historical scenarios. And sort of working class British humour they were in the 1970s, 1980s, that sort of period. Consistent with music hall culture. And so it sort of reminds me of like Carry On Up the Khyber or something, which is one of the more famous Carry On films, this track. And and there's a musical element in the track itself, actually. First of all, it sounds organ-like. And it has a chromatic run in the chorus that's reminiscent of musical comedy songs. Ooh, what to do in a tiny canoe, Eno concludes. Track 3, side 1, track 3 is called Kurt's Rejoinder. Now, this is more of a mood track, this one, I think it's fair to say. Once again, we have the postmodern dispositif, as they call it, in full effect here. We have the mixture of the ancient and the ultra-modern again. This is a minimalist piece again, I would say, because it's based on African drumming. I'm sure people will know that American minimalist music, at least, is influenced by Ghanaian drumming. But you also have rock and roll vocal structures here, namely the slightly childlike repetitions. Burger cruising just above the ground, and Ghana puts his burnish on his steel. Anna with the feelings moving round, is sharpening her needles on the wheel. I think that's the tune. But yeah, it's those sort of childlike repetitions. Plus, it's all built around a blue note in the sense of a flattened seventh in the major key. So once again, between the sort of the tribal and the extremely contemporary rock and roll, well, extremely contemporary at the time, I suppose. Although, where would we be without rock and roll today? What we have here is the foreshortening of time periods again, right? So, yeah, before and after science, indeed. It's difficult to explain what makes this one such fun. The rhythm is quite bracing, and the words are sort of absurdly funny. I mean, it sounds like a riddle to me. In other words, he's pretending to set out a riddle that you have to solve, Because, why is it called Kurt's Rejoinder? It's such a specific title. And Kurt is never mentioned, of course. Although Kurt is a German name, or maybe Austrian, I don't know. It could be something to do with quantum physics again. Another thing here is Eno's obsession with spiders comes out on this one. I mentioned in the previous episode there was a episode of Desert Island Discs on the BBC where famous people have to choose their favourite records, right? And there's a bit at the end of Desert Island Discs where the famous person in question has to choose a luxury object that they would take with them to their desert island. And Eno wanted a giant spider that he could spend his whole time trying to escape from. So he's obviously, as I said, obsessed with spiders. And the spider in this track actually has a name. She's called Anna. Her relationship to everything else here is completely unclear. The song almost seems to be set in the future where spiders have taken over, something like that. And I have heard a rumour that there are places like that on Earth already. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. And then at the end, we have a reference to everyone doing a new rock and roll dance, which Eno's apparently invented, called the Boston Crab, right? The Allemande, he says, do the Allemande and do the Boston Crab. Crabs and spiders are not directly related. This is like going back to our Animal Songs episode, our extremely well-received Animal Songs episode. But yeah, crabs and spiders do look a bit similar, don't they? It's also appropriate she's called Anna, I think, because in Freudian terms, a spider would represent the desire of the mother, right? Because the spider's mouth is moves from side to side, so it's vagina-like, basically. That is something crabs and spiders have in common. They both threaten to swallow us up. All right, good. Side 1, track 4, Energy Fools the Magician. Now, this is an instrumental track, slow, moody, sort of slightly prefaces the second side of the album where there's a lot of slow moodiness. Interesting title, Energy Fools the Magician. Again, energy as in quantum energy, let's say. And here, quantum energy exceeds the magician's attempt to control it, right? Which is another paradox, because the whole point about magic is to control it, but it can't be controlled, right? So this slightly reminds me of Mallarmé's, the poet Mallarmé's expression that the dice roll does not abolish chance. That's to say, even the person rolling the dice does not abolish chance. And even the magician can't control magic, I quite like that idea. Anyway, it's a nice tune, this one. It's rather moody, and first track in a minor key. It actually contains a tune in the Aeolian mode, for people who know what that is. And yeah, Aeolian is in ancient Greek, which is the language it comes from, is actually an ethnic designation, apparently. So we might actually be dealing with an evocation of place here, right? At least that's how I like to think about it. In any case, this track is an interlude, really. It's a rather portentous interlude due to the mode or scale that is being used, and the mood as well. The scale, because the Aeolian mode coincides with the natural minor scale, by the way. All right, good. Let's go to the final track on side 1, King's Lead Hat. Now, the title of this track is famously an anagram of Talking Heads. There you are. Second mention for them tonight. Now, this track is essentially an upbeat closer to side 1, at very high energy and rocky, very good fun. Starts with a driving alternation between two doo-wop chords, which is another rock and roll aspect, I suppose. It's C to A minor, isn't it? And he's doing that in a sort of, he's doing, again, a sort of space age version of something doo-woppy. I mean, it actually sounds a bit like the Undertones Teenage Kicks, that opening, I think, which came out at the same time, right? Is this track supposed to sound like Talking Heads? I mean, someone will let me know in the comments. He certainly seems to be singing like David Byrne, you know, in that sort of new wave, post-punk style. But in any case, this all just seems to be very ahead of its time to me. But hey, that's Eno for you, isn't it? Interesting lyrics here. Opens with a reference to Black Star. Remember you'll recall his eminent collaborator, David Bowie. Yeah, he's got his name right. Pronounced right. Who used this title for his final album 40 years later. And then we move from a car journey to a ship on the water. You get extra points for water references here on this album. And again, more science here. He sings, the biology of purpose keeps my nose above the surface. Now, this is old school science, of course. Biology of purpose. Although I suspect he's lampooning it. Right? Because this is a Darwinian thing, isn't it? Another reference to rivers and colonization. You know, carry on up the Khyber Pass. King's lead hat made the Amazon much wider, he sings. And finally, I mentioned earlier the desire of the mother. And it's referenced directly on this one. King's lead hat was a mother to desire, he says. So, yeah, the cross-references here make you wonder whether there is actually a conceptual continuity on the album. A concept album, as it were, but I think that's probably precipitate, that conclusion. Let's move to side 2, which I think is the more beautiful side, more interesting material, and frequently very lilting. And I sometimes feel like side 1 is a little bit of a preface to side 2 on this album, even though side 1 is filled with lovely, interesting pieces. But here we go deeper, I would say. Now, track 1, side 2 is called Here He Comes. Now, this is a very lovely pop song. And it sort of works like clockwork, this one, I think. In fact, it's my beloved Dave Mattox on drums on this one, I believe. So you'll notice straight away that it has this sort of brisk, folky lilt. Plus, nice rumba rhythm in the interlude in the middle. So that's folksy too, albeit not in a Celtic way. I think the tune is also like clockwork. It has a diatonic major key melody, which is almost sort of childlike in its simplicity and repeated over and over again, either vocally or instrumentally. But what happens with this little tune is that it sets us up for an amazing chorus, right, with a dramatic chord change to the subdominant. I think I've made clear previously on this podcast my theory that all great songs based on the classical scale require this change at some point. That's to say, the major third and the fourth chord, all the same in a relative minor position. In other words, a suspended chord, which gives melodic tension and interest, I think, to all good pop music, really. The Smiths are experts at it, by the way, in case you were wondering about the Smiths. And here, I think Eno treats it sort of iconically, paradigmatically. What key is it in? It's actually in D, isn't it? It's that sort of thing. I'm kind of improvising here. And here comes, those are the verses. And then here comes the chorus. Here he comes. And it's that comes. Right. I mean, I think that this is almost as iconic, this treatment, as the same effect which comes up in Erik Satie's first Gymnopédie, which is very famous. You know, everybody knows it. Unbelievably, this song is even in the same key as Satie's piece. People will know that piece. Sorry, my guitar's out of tune. Too late to do anything about that now, isn't it? Yeah, so as I said, Eno was definitely influenced by Satie, his philosophy of music, apart from anything else, I think. But also, you know, that piece. Why not? And he's sort of echoing it here in Here He Comes, right? Lyrics. We get more short circuits in time here. Here he comes, the boy who tried to vanish to the future or the past, right? I.e., from the point of view of the present, the future and the past are identical, right? Quantum again. And actually, you get the same thing with space on this track, because he says, here he comes, the boy who is no longer here, right? Which is, again, paradoxical. And he finally says, he rose above reason. Right, again, reason in the modern sense, right? So we're before and after the reason of the modern period, right? Before and after science, before and after reason in the modern sense, right? I mean, it's actually all rather touching, this song. Touching tune, touching story. The boy who wished to escape is no longer alone, he says. He's accompanied by the dragonflies, the insects, right? Again, we were talking about spiders earlier. I mean, spiders aren't insects, are they? But there's actually this isn't the last time on this album that a boy will be accompanied by arachnid friends, if not insect friends. Spoiler alert. So, yeah, in other words, what he's saying is that there are other converts to this lad's new way of thinking, right? Now, whether we can partake in it is as yet unclear. Eno leaves it open, right? He suggests that while we observe this scene being played out, you know, of the solidarity between the boy and the insects, the dragonflies, not the arachnids here, but the insects, the dragonflies, we are all standing in line and sort of resentfully checking out each other's supplies, as he calls them, in a Soviet or maybe even neoliberal style dystopia, who knows? Again, it's left obscure, but it's an interesting evocation, an interesting framing, let's say. Side 2, track 2 is called Julie with ... and it's in quotes, which is weird. This is the first track that's not in 4/4 as far as I remember. Sort of common time. This is in a lazy sort of 12/8 time signature. There's no drums from here on out on the album, by the way. So side 2, track 2, we're already in the last straight of the album, right? Quieter piece in a minor key, more moody, right? As I said, sort of echoing Energy Falls the Magician from side 1. This song is about the narrator and his girlfriend, presumably Julie, floating alone on a sailboat at sea, right? And the radio's not working. Will they be found, right? So again, it's a song about a lack of direct connection between us and the other. They want to be rescued, but by whom? I mean, at one point he says, by time itself. He said, I wonder if time has left us all alone. In other words, they're outside time in the normal sense, in the chronological sense. So again, we have a reference to like the quantum period in science here. And in the same sense, they're sort of, these two people, the narrator and Julie, are teetering on the edge of the void, right? He says, the still sea is darker than before, right? And again, this evokes, this kind of relates to the cover of the album, I think. Do you remember the cover? Do you remember that? I mentioned that a few minutes ago. In other words, he and Julie are trapped in an interstice, right? In time, and in space, maybe. Are they trapped together? Can you be trapped with others in an interstice? It's not clear. She might be dead. He says at one point her head is on her arm. She might not be there at all, actually. So the music here, I think, sort of evokes this, echoes this splendid isolation. Splendid isolation, another diplomatic term there, going back to the question of functionaries. The synth on this track is, of course, like a sound world unto itself, right? And the reverbed guitar sound is very pure too. So it's a sort of like a pure soundboard product, this one. So it's got a weird ambience. There's no air in it, which would be the case if you were in an interstice in time and space, I imagine, like an airlock. What about the structure? Seems to be in a minor key, but I mean that might be sort of a projection, as it were. Because actually, I don't think there's a third in there. It's in A, but there's just a B, basically. There is a chord sequence here and a tune, but again, it sort of evokes the uncanniness of the situation that the characters are in, because the notes don't actually fit naturally into the chords, right? Like on Backwater, side 1, track 2, we have a series of flattened fifths here, right? But it's a really strange and interesting melody in that sense, and it also doesn't quite, it's slightly disquieting, right? A mood which continues on the next track, side 2, track 3, By This River. Now, this is perhaps the highlight of the album, in my view. That's not quite fair because it's all great, this album, but this track is utterly beautiful and, again, properly minimalist this time. This track is perhaps the most Satie track of all. It's based on an ostinato keyboard pattern, right? And, again, like the gymnopédie kind of style. And also a repeated vocal line under which the chords change kind of tectonically. So this is a different kind of rock, I suppose, is being presented here. It's got a sense of stillness and at the same time kind of almost imperceptible subterranean shifts, right, in the chords. The lyrics again seem to refer to the predicament the narrator and Julie found themselves in on the last track. Again, is it a concept album? I don't know. They seem to be trapped somewhere next to a river, on a boat perhaps, as if on an ocean, he says, which is, again, could be a reference to the Turkish guru's daughter from track 2, side 1. Why not? Again, we've got spectres. Spectres here from other songs, right? And once again, we have the distance between the protagonists. You talk to me as if from a distance. In other words, we don't know if there's a distance or not. Which is why it's anxiety-inducing, of course. We don't know. If we knew, it wouldn't be a problem. Right? Finally, he says, I reply with impressions chosen from another time. So again, we have distancing and the non-chronological nature of time itself. So this isn't scientific in the modern sense, as I mentioned earlier, of like ordering principles. It's a different conception of science. This song always reminds me, of course, of the great Italian director Nanni Moretti. I don't know if people know his film The Sun's Room, which is an amazing film, won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. I can't remember the year. This guy's son dies, and he goes to his favourite record shop, the son's favourite record shop, to sort of remember him and to try to get a sense of who he was and what his life was like. And he asks the assistant, if I'm not misremembering, what kind of music his son was into. And the assistant gives him this album, and he takes it home, the father, the mourning father, and he plays it obsessively. But the thing is, he plays this song over and over again. That's the thing. So, yeah, it's a beautiful film, that, and this is basically the soundtrack, this track. And, of course, this song mentions being at sea, and the son in the film dies at sea, so I don't know if that's a deliberate connection, but it feels appropriate anyway because of the sombre sort of reflective vibe. So yeah, if you haven't seen that film, I would recommend it. Get yourself a VHS copy or whatever it is. Okay, penultimate track, side 2 is side 2, track 4 is Through Hollow Lands, right? And this is an instrumental, an even more morose sounding instrumental. It reminds me of Bowie's Berlin phase, which of course he shared with Eno. So that was on the horizon. And this whole album actually sounds pretty Krautish, I have to say, not aesthetically speaking. And yeah, as I've said, it was recorded in Germany. That normally helps if you want a German vibe. And yeah, as I said, there's German musicians working on some of the tracks. I suppose because they were in Germany. If you're in Germany, you want some musicians. They're likely to be German, aren't they? Once again, this piece is tectonic, I would say, and minimalist. I slightly have in mind here the tectonic shifts in Steve Reich's pieces. Above all, Music for 80 Musicians, but he uses it on other pieces as well, which are sort of repetitive, right? So they're and it's the chord changes often underneath the repetitions that provide colour, and that's what's happening here. Also, not unrelated, I think, to the situationist, quasi-Buddhist Erik Satie way of doing things, right? Modus operandi. Which I often think is sort of potentially related to John Cage's aleatory pieces as well. They sort of seem to be based on the capture of a sort of unrepeatable moment, right? And a singularity, in other words, right? Again, quantum physics. And such moments in Cage, Satie, or Reich are sometimes set up via processes, right? And yeah, this Eno piece, Through Hollow Lands, I think is a bit like all of that. Sort of a process piece. It also happens to be very moving, right? As I think a lot of Steve Reich stuff is. John Cage is a slightly different ball game, but and yeah, again, it has a sense of stillness. I suppose again this could be related to the idea of non-chronological time, which I mentioned earlier, although that might be a stretch in this case. Right, final track, Spider and I. I did promise another reference to arachnids. So yeah, this is a waltz this time, perhaps fitting with the German aesthetic. It's actually a rather good tune, this one. I'm not supposed to say that, I suppose. But the development of the melody is interesting and, once again, in that sense, kind of singular. But it's also got this minimalist, situationistic process feel, again, right? And yet again, it feels like we're sort of trapped in an interstice in time, right? And actually, it's funny because the song almost feels like an interstice in the piece, right? This track is basically an instrumental track with a song like floating in the middle, almost like the boat, that Julie and the narrator are trapped on track 2, side 2. The protagonist of this track, like the protagonist mentioned earlier, is a young lad who's taken an arachnid for a friend, right? So the story is that Spider and I, which is the title, and the opening line, I think, they're sitting around. So Spider and the narrator, the young lad, are sitting around lazily waiting for a spaceship to come and collect them, right? So again, spaceship, otherness, other side of the universe, quantum physics, quantum events, black holes. But yeah, it's played for humour. Quantum physics played for humour. Because it's funny, because these two lads got a spider for a friend, and they're sitting there waiting for a miracle, right? And it just sounds like such an absurd situation, right? Perhaps this is the final message of this album. It's about the miraculous, right? Quantum miracles, perhaps. But, these two are not that bothered one way or the other, which I think is funny, So yeah, the science of miracles. I often think quantum is like the science of miracles, hence all the folds in time, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's it. I suppose we can leave it there. That's it. An album about miracles. There you go. That's my conclusion. And scientific miracles this time. And I hope that's been of some interest. If not, sorry. And I'll see you on the next episode, which should be coming up next week. And I hope you have a good evening or whatever awaits you. Ta-ra for now.